Now, like to invite Mr. Rajiv Malhotra to shed more light on this very important civilizational issue with which we all are very much concerned. So thank you very much.
Namaskar. It is indeed an honor to be here. I have come back after a gap of a few years, and I recognize many old friends, people I've known for quite a long time. Kundan, who introduced me, I think, since 2000, when he first came to the US as a graduate student. And then Sankrant, I don't know if he's here somewhere, there he is, maybe a couple years later. He also became very active on my discussion group. Then he became an advisor to Infinity Foundation, and we did a lot of things for the last 15 years. And then I think a few years later, Manohar Shinde, he's somewhere here too, he started visiting, we started having a lot of conversations, and then he would promote some of these ideas to other Hindu groups in this country. When my journey started, this particular part of my journey, which has been more than 50% of my adult life on a full-time basis, it's not a weekend hobby. The original vision for the foundation was wisdom and compassion. Compassion being things you do for your fellow human being. A lot of activities went in that area. You might call it charity or, things from medicine to food programs in New Jersey. Believe me, there's a lot of hungry people in New Jersey, animal shelters and things of that sort. And then the other part was wisdom, which is Gyan. Over time, the compassion part became private. So it continues, but it's not where we are very public. And the wisdom part took off because I realized that's where there's a huge opportunity and a lot of resistance towards our civilization. So we did programs in schools. We took students from Princeton Day School every spring break to Rishikesh and other places so that they would get an Indian perspective as part of their world religions course. Many of those students actually converted to Hinduism. Some of them are practicing Hindus today. And that was one of the earliest and most successful school programs in New Jersey, and it's been replicated in a few other places. Now, as Kundan said, the first thing that occurred to me was because I was in the tech industry, and we know concepts like angel investor, venture capitalist, and so on. So my role initially was as an angel investor in Dharma studies. I was giving grants to other people on the promise that they would do the kind of things we wanted, rather than doing it myself. That's what angel investors do. So we gave 2 chairs to Harvard, visiting professorships. One was Arvind Sharma, one was Ashoka Klujkar. That was very successful, and we learned a lot of things. When Arvind Sharma got his chair, and the reason I'm telling you is some of these things you are learning also. And by sharing these ideas with each other, maybe we can benefit each other. And then I'll tell you the history, why we started studying the history of Indology and the politics of Indology in order to get ahead of the curve. But in Harvard, when Arvind Sharma got the chair to teach 2 courses, very provocatively titled. One was called Misrepresentations of Hinduism in the American Academy. Can you believe Harvard, in their course catalog, has if you look back in those years, has a course called Misrepresentations of Hinduism in the American Academy? Well, we got it there. I'll tell you then what happened. The other one was Appropriations of Hinduism and Buddhism, Unacknowledged Appropriations of Hinduism and Buddhism in the Western Civilization. So in one case, we are teaching them that you guys are misrepresenting us. In the other case, we're teaching them that you are actually stealing from us. And this is my conception of what I wanted, because after going around, I found these things are going on. And so we got Arvind Sharma, and he got a visiting professorship, and he was going to teach these things. The mistake we made is we got it negotiated, all this, when Diana Eck was on vacation. So the chair told us we can put it through. We put it through. It was official. The catalog is printed. Students are there. And Arvind Sharma starts teaching. And then Diana Eck comes back from vacation. And boy, is she ticked off. That how can it happen when you say misrepresentation of Hinduism, by implication it's people like me. And she could not believe that we would be actually talking about misrepresentations in a academic world where she was one of the pioneers. So a lot of ruffled feathers. So what I'm trying to tell you is we've been there, we've negotiated these things, we've done it the hard way, we've lost, we won. Then I funded the Harvard Indology Roundtable for 5 years. Every year, they would bring about 50 scholars from around the world. And what was unique was that they would bring Pakistani scholars, Indian scholars, people from all over Europe, because Pakistanis were not allowed to go to India and talk to their collaborators, and Indians were not allowed to go to Pakistan, but both could come to Harvard, and so Harvard could put it all together. But of course, they would put it together with their own perspective. So we funded that also for a while. Then Columbia University, we funded programs. One was a philosophy department program. Another one was with Buddhist studies with Robert Thurman. We funded Princeton University programs. University of California, Santa Barbara, for 3 years in a row, we were the ones who were sponsoring their program on science and religion, which was later taken over by Templeton because they offered them more money. But for 3 years, our idea of scientific inquiry in the dharmic system was taught by Alan Wallace, a Buddhist physicist with the Dalai Lama follower. Beautiful teaching, and then Templeton came. So I'm going to get to a point on what you can learn from all this. Rutgers University, we taught Hindi. In most places, when they had Hindi, they were teaching Urdu. And if you signed up for Hindi 101, and some people signed up for Urdu 101, you sit in the same class and study together, same thing. But your transcript says Hindi, his transcript says Urdu, actually teaching Urdu. Ali Asani at Harvard was teaching that, Pakistani guy. So I went to Rutgers and said, I'd like to have Hindi, but I don't want this Urdu business. So they said, oh, no prejudice allowed and all. It's a state university, just like your UCI. It's a state university. And state has all this, separation of religion, of church and state and non-discrimination, very, very serious clauses. The chair of languages was a Korean. So we talked privately. And I said to him, what if you have a chair of Korean language studies, but what they're teaching is Chinese because they're saying it's same as Korean. Like people saying Urdu is similar to Hindi. The way Hindi is similar to Urdu, Korean is similar to Chinese. Korean, Chinese, and Japanese have similarities. What would your sponsor say? He said they'll never accept it. They will never accept it. I said, okay, so what can you do for me? And he gave me a recipe of what we should ask for, how we should ask for it. And it will get through, because that particular use of language would get through. That's how we got Hindi studies taught by a very solid Hindi teacher. And after we funded it for 3 years, we phased it out because there is a Hindi organization. They took over the funding since we don't have the money to keep. We just pioneered the work and turned it over. Then University of Hawaii, we had a $250,000 budget, and we went on for 8 years to teach Indian philosophy in a very different way, and they did quite a bit. And then we evaluated to see where do these students go, do they U-turn, do they not U-turn. We found out that, we're investing in certain kind of students, and then most of them are using it in a way that we wouldn't want them to use it, but we have no control. So we are teaching people, and while they are learning, they're getting fellowships and scholarships, they're very grateful to us. I get all these great thank you letters, I have lots of them. But when they go out into the real world with this knowledge, what they do with it is sometimes quite mischievous. So we had a friendly parting. Now, each one of these experiences was terminated by us, never by them. Never by them. And most of them were just continued because we were considered heroes. Nobody else was funding such studies in those days. I'm talking about mid-90s onward. University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, where I'm still the chair of Indic Studies, Center for Indic Studies, was probably the most successful example. It was a successful example because the chancellor of the whole university system was a friend. And this lady, she was so fond of us, we were one of the good centers in their entire university system across the state. It's a state university. So she was championing us, she would protect us, and even when these leftist Indians would raise issues, she would kind of put it aside. And that was one factor, champion at the very top. And the second factor was Balram Singh, a chemistry professor, very solid in the whole concept. So the two of us worked very closely together. We got in everything you can imagine. As much Hindu as you can imagine, as much practice, as much worship. We did practices which we call laboratory. This is a psychology laboratory, ritual laboratory. So it's not like, religion can't be brought in or something like that, because we had all kind of things going, because we had support. So we could do this. Then, unfortunately, the chancellor retired. The new chancellor doesn't see the things the same way. And Balram Singh retired. And so the lesson is, unless you have it in writing, having a good personal understanding is not good enough. The personal understanding will evaporate because personalities change. People come and go. It's like in your business, in your corporate life, you would never have a long-term contract with some entity on the basis that we are friends with this guy and he said okay, but it's not written down, because people change. Political pressure changes. So anyway, as a result of all this, and I was very hands-on, I was not an angel investor hands-off, writing a check and saying, okay, give me a good photo op every time I'm there. I really wanted to read all the all the production of knowledge and so on. And as a result of that, I became very knowledgeable in intervening, in raising questions. I would sit in their dissertation defense and raise issues. I would argue with the professors, and of course, they found it to be a bit of a nuisance, because they would say, Infinity Foundation is great. Rajiv Malhotra is a problem. So we want your money, but we don't want your brains. Please give us your money and then keep quiet, because we know the job, you shouldn't be interfering. That's not what my IT, entrepreneurial investment, angel investing background taught me. I thought, I have to be a very active, hands-on interventionist investor. Why not? It's my culture. So I decided that one of the things I should do, and then I became my own author and writer. Now, that's what I do now. But I decided that I should study the industry of Indology like you study telecom industry. Who are the suppliers? Who are the distributors? Where did the funding come from? What are the products? Why they do this? Who uses it? Who are the users? What's the impact? All of those kind of questions. And that's when I studied the history of Indology. And I understood German Indology. And by the way, there has never been a book on the history of Indology. I'm putting one together. There are little snippets of some German period and some French period and so on. But to give you in a nutshell, British and German and French, three kinds of Indologists in Europe at that time, from the late 1700s onward, had different agendas. So you cannot lump them all together. Germans were not interested in colonizing India. British Indology had an interest in how to rule these people by studying them and understanding them and creating divide and bhed and all that stuff and negotiating better and pretending to be one of them and so on, and pretending that the laws we are enacting are really the Dharma Shastras so that they will accept it better. So British were studying it from a manipulative governance point of view. Germans had no interest in that because they were not interested in colonizing, never were. Their interest was they were developing a sense of identity for themselves, which culminated in the Aryan identity. So the discovery of Sanskrit being very close to German gave them an edge over French and English because German was closer. So praising Sanskrit texts was actually praising their own heritage. That's what they felt. And so in their civilizational kind of chauvinism vis-a-vis other Europeans, the discovery of Sanskrit by them and its greatness was something fantastic. So all kind of German products came out on Sanskrit studies, praising it as their heritage that their ancestors had developed. So all this business, and then the French had their own agenda. French and Russians, there were some Russian Indologists also. There were one or two Italian Indologists also. So to do a proper study on the history of Indology, I have it broken into all these different countries. And even within England, there were 7 or 8 during the 150 years of this period that I'm looking at. There were 7 or 8 different ideological views from which Indology was studied. There were people called Orientalists, there were many kinds of people. And the East India Company was actually competing against evangelists because they did not want the Christian evangelists to come and mess up their job of making money. They wanted to have no interference from the church or anybody else because their job was to maximize the profit, make money, and get out, and just keep siphoning off the money. And sometimes the church, because the church people didn't report to them, they felt threatened. So actually, it's not correct to say that they were all one and they all had one Christian agenda. That is not true. Some of them were representing Christianity. There were some of them who were totally un-Christian. Back home, they were fighting the Christians, kind of the proverbial left versus right camp we have in the US. They were actually fighting the Christians, but they were collaborating in the study of India. So India studies, or Indology, was carried out by people who in their own country were fighting, in their own continent. British fighting other British Indologists back home, but here for studying India, they would collaborate. British fighting, French having wars with Germany, being rivals in Europe, would collaborate on India. So Max Miller, German, was employed by East India Company, British. You see, so these collaborations are the sort of thing that happens today when you say, why is it that the Western left is funding Indology and Hinduphobia, and the Christians on the right are doing the same, while at home they are fighting each other, but when it comes to studying India, they're collaborating against the left, and the Islamic people and the Christian people are united against Hinduism. But the headquarters of the Christian right, which is United States, is at war with the nexus of Islam. Here they're at war, but in India they're together because they have a common enemy. So this is an old background to this kind of thing. So this resulted in a lot of opportunism by Indian princes negotiating, trying for their own personal gain, their own personal benefit rather than the collective good. And gradually the colonialists with Indology was a very powerful weapon by the colonialists because it shaped their policy, it manipulated the Indians, it also, they siphoned off a lot of knowledge in linguistics, mathematics, philosophy, a lot of things, which is part of the story. And they first took over, the first Varna, if you look at Varna as form of social capital, not as ethnic or by birth, but is a form of competence, functional competence. You know, and if you look at Vaishyas as commerce, business capital, business, acumen, the East India Company came as Vaishyas. They came as business people, and they got the better of the Indian side. Then they took over the Kshatriya role, the role of ruling, governance, in the Madras and Bengal, starting with those two, and then spread elsewhere. So that was their conquest of the Kshatriya Varna. And the Indian Rajas became secondary, less important. Some were just thrown out. Some became, satellites and subservient. But they did not take over the Brahmin Varna for a long time. For the first long period of time, East India Company started in 1600. And Macaulay, his groundbreaking lectures in the Parliament are in the early 1800s, 1830s and somewhere around there. So it's 230 years after the East India Company has been in India thriving that they start the process of saying, let's take over knowledge, let's replace Sanskrit with English, let's take over their pathshalas and train babus, let's manipulate the whole knowledge system in our favor. So this takeover of the knowledge side, the Brahmin side, and I'm using these terms not as sort of caste, but I'm using them as the different kind of potential that society has, the Vaishya potential, the Kshatriya potential, and the Brahmin potential. So the Brahmin was the last one they took. And this capturing of all the three Varnas completed the colonial, the rule, because they could not have done it without all three. So Indology served as a way of making up an idea of India and selling it to the Indians. The whole Indian history, John Mill, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, he wrote these multiple volumes on called The History of India, full of nonsense and prejudice. That was taught for several generations to every official of the East India Company. Before he was sent to India, he would read that. That was his idea of India. And then his son, John Stuart Mill, who became a very big shot in the East India Company, is considered one of the pioneers of human rights in the West. If you take a course in the philosophy department and you look at human rights, rights of workers, liberalism, you will find that egalitarianism, you will find one of the leaders of that movement in the West is a man named John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill is doing this great emancipation business at home, but in India, he is the leading thinker to colonize. So what a contradiction. But then he gave a reason why, they're children, we need to do it to help them and whatnot. That's a different story. So the story of Indology and it's breaking it down into different ideological lenses within the European people and breaking it down into different competing nationalisms, the German, the French, the English, all that's a very important part of studying, for us to study. You have to study in order to be able to deal with them. Once you have that knowledge, and they're sitting down and they are lecturing at you because they've studied all your castes, they've studied all the different sampradayas, they know Vaishnava versus Shaivite, you don't know. I mean, they can, if you know Sanskrit, they can start chanting Tamil at you. I mean, they can really do that. And our people who are negotiating are not in the driver's seat because we are looking at them with awe. They can also then give you a nice bhajan and give you a nice chant and you'll be very happy, oh yeah, this guy is very good. So you have to get even with studying their history. And one of the things that even the post-colonials have never done is to study the link. This is very important. The link between the English in America, who came in the 1600s to settle, the white settlers who came, and later came slavery, but first was the oppression of Native Americans, and their approach to otherizing the non-whites resembles very closely the Indologists' view of Indians. This is something amazing. You see cartoons of how they're depicting some Native Americans and blacks in this country in the 1600s, 1700s, and you see similar things happening about how they're depicting Indians. You see what the Indologists are writing about India. They're projecting what they have learned in America and other continents about non-whites. So they're projecting, they've learned about non-Western civilizations, and then in India, they're projecting that sort of a thing, looking for those data points. Very interesting. This kind of study you have to do. So when they talk to me a certain way, I can say, you're saying like this, I don't blame you, you're a nice guy, you're a wonderful guy, but this thinking comes from your ancestors when they were genociding the Native Americans. Here is my source. Here is why, here is how this whole thing started. So I don't blame you, you're good, we're both friends. But this is where this genre of knowledge comes. And they're shocked because they have not ever come across an Indian who tell them that. So you have to be armed with knowledge about them. You must know as much as you can about the other side because they know a lot about us. They've studied us to death, literally. So this, we have a system called Purva Paksha, which means you study the other. So when people tell me, oh no, we don't like to do this, we are peace-loving people, we don't, everybody's same and whatnot, I remind them of the term Purva Paksha, that the Purva Paksha system, and then all the traditional people recognize it, according to in the Purva Paksha system, which is mandatory for our scholars, you study the other and understand him on his own terms, why he is doing, what is his logic, what is good about it, you understand and appreciate it. Then you do Uttar Paksh, which means you respond. And then you establish Siddhant. This is the theory. This is my principle. After having looked at you, taken you into consideration, given you my argument. And then, of course, the other guy has the right to do the same in reverse. This is how Vedanta happened. This is how the debates with Buddhists, with Mimamsa, all of that happened. The question is, why did Purva Paksha stop when the foreigners came? Why didn't we do Purva Paksha of Islam? Why didn't we do Purva Paksha of Christianity when the British came, or of the East India Company mercantile ideology? Or when there was the European Enlightenment movement, why didn't we do Purva Paksha of that? So what I'm trying to do is revive the Purva Paksha system by bringing, not by invoking our own Indologists, I call them Swadeshi Indologists, to do this Purva Paksha of Western thought and Western history on dharmic terms. It is not enough for us to study ourselves, because the comparative methodology is so common. Everybody you talk to, school children, anybody, they are talking about all the cultures, all the religions. So you have to be able to do comparative stuff, but we have to do it on our terms, because right now the comparative stuff is being done on somebody else's terms. So it's not a war very simple at the surface about facts, about this point in history and that data was wrong. It's much deeper a war about very, very deep metaphysical assumptions about the nature of the cosmos, about cosmology, about your categories and philosophical approaches, methodologies, and so on. Now, I could go on for a long time, but I've been told I have 5 minutes left, so I'll just wrap up very quickly. I'm doing a 3-day workshop, full 3-day workshop. Indian government department has invited 3-day workshop in Delhi. The date hasn't been set, but probably late November sometime, on this whole issue of Indology, past, present, future, and what we are supposed to do, what should be our blueprint, what others are doing, you know. So I'm just trying to give you a little glimpse of it. But I'll close by saying, we have started an initiative called Swadeshi Indology. Swadeshi does not mean it has to be in India. It has to be an Indian perspective and an Indian lens. It doesn't have to be an ethnic Indian either. So it's not about race, ethnicity, or location. And the opposing view is the Videshi Indology. So these are points of view and not about the personality of who's doing it. For example, Romila Thapar would be Videshi Indologist, although she's based in India. And many of Sheldon Pollock's students and Wendy's students, and they're all Videshi Indologists. Devdutt Patnaik type. It has to do with the point of view. So we're very clearly defining what are the defining qualities, what are the characteristics, what are the non-negotiables that are the pillars of the Swadeshi Indology. So each target school of Videshi Indology, we are going to do 2 conferences and then do a book. We've done the first conference on Sheldon Pollock's school of Neo-Orientalism. We are going to do the second conference in February, then do a book. And we are extremely high standard of rigor in selecting speakers. So it's not that, you are invited, come give a talk, nothing like that. There is a referee, 3 referees, anonymous, and they're of exceedingly high standard people, very senior people. Nobody will know their name. They evaluate every paper when it's submitted. They give marks, and then there is a system to reject, accept, or tell the person to improve and send it back. Last time we had 60 people interested. We ended up having about 15 actual talks. This time, again, we have almost twice as many people interested, and we have room for 36 slots. So we are growing quality rather than quantity. It's not a mela, it's not gathering of like-minded people, give high-level talk and high-level perspective. It's very deep, detailed analysis. I'll give you an example of what is going to happen in the second conference, which is very innovative. And I mentioned this to, Shashi Tiwari ji, whom you know from, she's the head of Waves, and people like Arvind Sharma, whom you also know. They're very impressed that this is innovative and something that hasn't been done. What we're going to do is a group of Sanskrit traditional scholars who only know Sanskrit. They are studied so much, they're in the south, under one of the Shankaracharyas, and they are traditional Sanskrit scholars who know our text like nobody does. And this is going to be a debate between Sheldon Pollock and them, and Pollock refuses to come, so I'll represent Pollock. So, I'll have a lot of his books, labeled, marked paragraphs I want to read out to get their response, a lot of his papers. So we'll take about 15 or 20 topics. And each topic, I will say, this is the book, this is the page number, and I will read out what he has said. Then there is another person who's bilingual. He knows English and Sanskrit. He will first paraphrase in English, paraphrase what it means in English for people to understand. And then he will give the Sanskrit translation. And then the students there will be a group of those Sanskrit people debating. They will have a certain amount of time, and they will give a response in Sanskrit. So they will use Mimamsa, Navya Nyaya, they will use very solid Sanskrit, our traditional theories of how you interpret texts, and they will give their rejoinder. And then this interpreter will translate it back into English. We'll videotape this, and we'll have it in the 3-day conference. We'll have a segment of this every single day. And when I mentioned this to Arvind, he says, you know, this will shake them because they've never, ever experienced the real Indian traditionalist talking back like that. Because they just don't know that we can actually talk back like that. So this kind of a very authentic Purva Paksha is what we are planning to do further. So after these two are done, we will probably do 2 conferences on Romila Thapar, then we'll do 2 on Wendy Doniger, then we'll go on to other people. So every 2 conferences will be one school of thought, which will be a very concentrated school of Western Indology. And the idea is to produce something which will topple them, which will become non-ignorable, which will be a referenced book that every student has to study, because if you're studying so many scholars involved, that it will be impossible to ignore it. I would love to continue, but I think since time is up, we'll take the rest of it during Q&A. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for inviting me. I hope this begins a good collaboration between us.